Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Rachel Jacobson. I'm the Deputy Director at American Society of Adaptation Professionals, and we're going to give it just a couple of minutes to let folks enter the room here. So sit tight, grab some coffee or lunch, and we will get started in just a minute. All right, let's get started. So my name is Rachel Jacobson. I'm Deputy Director at American Society of Adaptation Professionals, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm calling in today from Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is lands of the Anishinaabe and Wyandot peoples. And as we get started, I want to invite everyone who's here in the room to introduce themselves in the chat. We'd love to know who you are and where you're calling in from. Welcome to Measuring Adaptation Progress, Understanding the Global Stocktake and Global Goal on Adaptation as part of ASAP's co-creation webinar series. So just some logistics info as we get started. Please stay on mute. Feel free to turn your camera on or off as you like. We are actually going to have a small group discussion as part of our event today. So we'd love for you to have your camera on for that and either on or off during our plenary session. You can share any tech support questions by direct Zoom chat to Megan Putnam or Brianna Nails. They're here to support you. We are going to be using Slido today to take questions for our Q&A with our presenters. So we'll be sharing that information with you in just a minute in the chat. And feel free to use the Zoom chat for discussion with one another. Please use Slido for sending in questions for our Q&A with our presenters. So before we get started with our formal program, I'll just share a brief introduction to American Society of Adaptation Professionals in case this is the first event that you're joining with us. So here at ASAP, we connect and support climate change adaptation and climate resilience professionals to better address climate impacts. Our members are building essential climate resilience for communities, ecosystems, and economies across North America. At ASAP, we help members strengthen their professional network, exchange best practices and practical advice, and accelerate innovation, all leading to more equitable and effective climate adaptation practice. And at ASAP, it's really all about the people. Here on the screen, you can see just a few faces of ASAP members who inspire one another every day to do critical adaptation work on the ground. Here at ASAP, we define adaptation professional as anyone who uses future climate information in their day-to-day work. So that includes everyone from engineers and architects to community organizers and teachers. And the strength of our network is in its sectoral and regional diversity. We have ASAP members in almost every US state, in 4 Canadian provinces, in the UK, Australia, and our network is almost evenly split between folks working in the public sector, for-profit companies, nonprofit organizations, and academia, covering people providing climate adaptation services at all scales. And at ASAP, we believe that we all have something to learn from one another and that we can make better change when we come together across those different contexts. ASAP's work is made possible through funding we receive from membership dues, including dues from individuals and organizations. Organizations that join ASAP extend the benefits of membership to their staff, clients, and colleagues, and ensure they have a hand in both building the adaptation field and benefiting from the resources and knowledge that come from ASAP membership. And you can see here on this slide the many, many organizational members that we have here at ASAP. Our programs are designed to build the capacity of our members to do equitable and effective adaptation work. And they include ASAP Connects, where folks come together to share ideas and explore important topics in adaptation. Adaptation careers, where folks have training and education opportunities to excel in their jobs and find new opportunities. Adaptation Voices, which is all about telling the stories of excellent adaptation work that's happening on the ground to inspire more adaptation action, and ASAP Serves, where we have member leaders contributing and giving back to the adaptation field. And our co-creation webinar series is both a training and learning opportunity, as well as an opportunity for us to lift up stories of innovative adaptation work from across sectors. Since 2020, we've been collaborating with partners to bring you the co-creation webinar series. And each of those webinars focused on three things: showcasing innovative adaptation work that is yielding tangible, replicable results, illustrating how collaboration across sectors enables that work, and describing how justice and equity principles are integrated into adaptation action. And you can see all of our previous co-creation sessions covering everything from sea level rise standards to adaptation finance to the Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosures, all on our YouTube channel, a link to which is coming around in the chat. But today, we are actually using this space for something a bit different. So every year, ASAP members ask, how is ASAP engaging with COP, with UNFCCC processes? And this year, we are really excited to be hosting this pre-COP27 webinar focused on measuring adaptation progress to really respond to those member requests. So for this event, we've lined up two expert presenters to share important insights and details on two ways that the global community is working towards measuring adaptation progress: the global stocktake of the Paris Agreement and the global goal on adaptation. So first, we are excited to be hearing from Timo Leiter, a distinguished researcher on adaptation monitoring and evaluation systems. And then we'll hear from Brittany Kroll, who serves as the lead US negotiator for the global stocktake. After a Q&A with Brittany and Timo, we'll move into small group discussion spaces where you'll have a chance to share your own reflections and ideas on these processes and kickstart the development of an ASAP member comment to the Global Stocktake Information Portal. And I'll share more information when we get to that point in our program. So I really hope that you'll stay for both the presentation and discussion sections of our event today. So we can all work together to prepare our adaptation community to really strongly engage in COP27. So first, I am so pleased to welcome Timo Leiter. Timo is a researcher and policy advisor on climate change adaptation and a PhD candidate at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He's a renowned expert on monitoring and evaluation of climate adaptation, on which he has authored numerous journal articles, guidebooks, and training materials. Timo's a contributing author of the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, Working Group 2 on Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability, and a lead author of the United Nations Environment Programme's annual Adaptation Gap Report. Prior to joining the London School of Economics, Timo worked at Germany's International Development Agency, including as head of support for adaptation to the Tanzanian government. He's been advising several government ministries on adaptation to climate change and has been observing the UN climate change negotiations since 2015. Welcome, Timo.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and hi, everyone. Good morning to you. Yeah, thank you once again. I'm happy to present you kind of an overview of how adaptation can be assessed globally and some of the findings from the recent IPCC reports and the other approaches, and then kind of building the bridge to Brittany's presentation on what this means for the negotiations. So the big question really is, what is the 2-degree equivalent for adaptation? Do we have one, or 1.5 degree equivalent? So for mitigation, we can measure it through a clear global metric, 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, or parts per million in the atmosphere. But do we have any equivalent on the adaptation side? Spoiler alert, we don't, but I'm going to show you some of the approaches that have been used or that could be used in the future. Starting very briefly with a recap of why measuring adaptation is so different from measuring mitigation. And this table really sums it up. So mitigation, MRV, is about measuring the physical quantities, stuff you can measure through objective scales, degree centigrade, parts per million, tons of emissions. So there are units of measurement which are independent of context, which are based in natural science and in physics. For adaptation, it's very different. For adaptation, what we're measuring is not just physical states, but adaptation is a social change process. which has many different meanings to different people. So therefore, it's very different to measure compared to mitigation. And we do not have a clear objective scale or global metric for adaptation. And adaptation measurement is quite context specific. So even if you use the same metric, let's say water use per capita, it can have very different meanings for people living in different circumstances around the world. And that's in a nutshell why we don't have a single global metric for adaptation, and we will never have one. Because the characteristics of adaptation, at least under the current definitions that have been used for the last decades, aren't going to change. Adaptation is going to remain a social change process. So that's kind of the backdrop. I think that's why we're having the webinar in the first place, to talk about, okay, what can we do despite the differences? What solutions do we have? If you're interested in this background, I've had a chapter in this unit publication from 2018, speaking of the pitfalls and potential of measuring adaptation through indicators. One more important distinction for our discussion today is the difference between inputs, outputs, and outcomes, which the OECD is using in its development assessments. And I guess you're familiar with this, but I wanted to illustrate it through this recent and very unfortunate example from the extreme events in Puerto Rico. You may have seen this video which went viral of this bridge getting washed away, which was just a couple of days ago. But we can use it to illustrate the difference between output and outcomes. So imagine if you had been on a mission to Costa Rica to see this bridge, and importantly, as this Twitter post shows, this bridge was only installed after the previous one also got washed away. So if you had been on a mission in Puerto Rico as recently as last week or last month, you would have assessed that the outcome, the bridge is there. So you would have ticked the box, okay, there's a bridge and it got, rebuilt, okay, fine. But a week later, even that new bridge got washed away. So even if the output was achieved until couple of days ago, the outcome of climate resilient infrastructure that can withstand similar extreme events clearly wasn't met as we know today. And one of the difficulties or problems we face globally on adaptation assessment is that most of it is based on measuring outputs, number of policies, number of people, number of new assets being built. But what we really want to know is that helping us does it make people more resilient? Are people better adapted as a result of those outputs? And it's that linkage between outputs to outcomes that's very difficult to assess at the global level. A final content slide or background slide is this one. So assessing outputs is relatively straightforward, number of something, but assessing adaptation outcomes, are we really adapting? That is very difficult. And the table just shows some of the for additional challenges that complicate the assessment. One question is the time horizon. So are you effective or successful against what level of climate risk? So unfortunately, greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise, and so climate risks also continue to increase. So at what point do you want to assess effectiveness against the current risks, or risks in 5 years, or risks in 2050, which again, the longer you go into the future, the more uncertain the projections will be. So there's that uncertainty. And finally, just mentioning briefly this aspect of equity and maladaptation, which has also played an important role in the recent IPCC report. So even if one group of people successfully adapts and achieves outcomes, it could have been at the expense of another group. And that is very tricky. And that is a fundamental difference to measuring mitigation, where we can just count the number of emissions, of reduced emissions, and it doesn't matter where they have been, reduced, and it will have the same positive effect globally on anyone in any country. But for adaptation, that's very different. And therefore, for adaptation, we cannot simply add up numbers, because it affects people in different ways in different places. So that's the situation we are facing. And so in today's presentation, I wanted to give you an overview of a couple of recent approaches or initiatives or possibilities, and discuss, their pros and cons in terms of understanding global adaptation progress. Starting with the one most commonly suggested, namely to have a global set of adaptation indicators. Um, let's look at the requirements that this would have. So we would need to have indicators that would be relevant to all countries. There would need to be global data availability, including from least developed countries. Very importantly, we would need to have common measurement standards. This is actually often forgotten. It's not sufficient to agree on an indicator. If it's not clear how that indicator is being measured, it's of no use. So we would, I guess, all agree on the indicator, avoided economic damages due to extreme events. But then how do you measure that through, in a globally comparable way in very different contexts? Also meaningfulness for adaptation. So let's taking, there's often data on agriculture, for example. Recently, there was one suggested indicator, area of land under productive use. Okay, fine, but what does this tell us about adaptation? Then we don't know, is it productive because of adaptation, or have climate risk even been factored in? So the meaningfulness for adaptation is an issue. And of course, the political agreement. So if this global set of indicators was to be used at the global level and would require some, or was supposed to have some endorsement under UNFCCC, it would require all parties to agree by consensus, which is very difficult. So for the moment, the IPCC recent assessment report working group 2 is concluded that a set of all-purpose and globally applicable standard indicators does not exist. And the point here really is purpose. We're going to talk about this later again. What do you want these indicators to do? Why do you want these indicators in the first place? Do you hope they are informing something or someone? And then the question is, are they fit for that particular purpose? So we will not get a single global universal set that can do everything at the same time. That simply is not realistic. And before moving to the index aspect, I wanted to show you one example of global adaptation indicators. So there are a couple of funds globally which support developing countries on adaptation, and this table here lists the core indicators that that 3 of these funds are using: the Adaptation Fund, Germany's International Climate Initiative, and the Pilot Program for Climate Resilience and the Development Group, to assess adaptation across their portfolios. So these funds have projects in all developing countries. It's very different in very different sectors. And as you can see, almost all the indicators are number of something, and which again shows that output indicators are quite common. Stuff which can easily be counted as common, but it doesn't tell us whether adaptation has actually been achieved. And those indicators listed here, which are classified as outcomes, like meters of coastline protected. But again, does this say that something is well adapted? Hectares of natural habitat restored? So the key point here is that you require further assumptions whether those indicators actually tell you about adaptation outcomes. So this table is part of a background paper which I led for the Global Commission on Adaptation in 2019. And I'm just showing you it's actually quite difficult already, even for each of these global funds, to agree on these or to find relevant indicators that are relevant across the portfolio. And the next step would be for all those global funds to agree on common indicators, which they haven't, or to agree on common methodologies, which they haven't. And then, the next step would be on the global level. So it shows you the scale of the challenge and where we stand. In terms of indices, some people might have the idea to have one global adaptation index. All indices have the difficulty that the results which they produce are totally dependent on how you construct the indice. I just wanted to show you one example here. So this is the list of the top 20 countries, the most vulnerable 20 countries worldwide, according to 4 different indices. And you see that you get wildly different lists of countries. So it's not, first of all, there's a different country at the top of each of these lists, but very few countries even appear in more than one of these lists. This is from Global Vulnerability Indices. So if you were to imagine anything similar for adaptation, it would be similar. And this is also where the point of political agreement comes in, because it has consequences what indicators would be chosen, because it would rank some countries higher than others and might have implications for adaptation finance. And therefore, if one thing is certain, is that we will not get any such globally UNFCCC approved adaptation index at all. In fact, the countries haven't agreed in 30 years on how to measure whether a country is particularly vulnerable, which is the term from the convention. So if there's one certainty I can present to you today, that a global index on adaptation will not be agreed under UNFCCC. This then leads us to the question, okay, what can be done? Yeah, and this is a question that we haven't only been asking now for the GST, but under UNEP's adaptation gap report, which you might have come across, we have faced this this challenge. Okay, what can we say about global adaptation progress? And the report has been around since 2014, but it got a new structure in 2020, which is centered around these three core pillars: planning, finance, and implementation. These are the three core dimensions the report is assessing in terms of global adaptation progress. And we just looked at, okay, what data do we have available on these three dimensions globally? So on planning, it's mainly based on country documents and submissions to UNFCCC. Very importantly, this report is not limited to quantitative indicators, but instead it looks at the quality of adaptation plans, which is very important, because one of the SDG indicators, for example, is number of countries with a plan. But what does this tell you if the plan isn't being implemented, or if the plan is not good or doesn't have political ownership? So this is one of the features here. On finance, the chapter looks at OECD climate finance data and other data. And in the implementation chapter, which I lead, we look at, okay, what data do we have from the scientific literature, from the global funds that I just presented? We just add up or take the information we have from multiple sources on what adaptation actions have already been taken. So in essence, in fact, I think the adaptation gap report has been doing what the global Stocktake on adaptation is about to do, or is in the process of doing. It's one approach. So I'm just showing this to say that the GST is not the first time, and it's really important to not be kind of stuck on indicators, but trying to see whatever you can take, whatever information is there that you can synthesize to get an understanding of adaptation actions globally, adaptation progress globally. One of the inputs we had for the report is called the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative, which was a very large initiative for more than 120 authors. This was a key input to a section in the most recent IPCC report. So the question here was, in all the published journal articles that are indexed in certain databases, what evidence do we have of implemented adaptation, not of adaptation options or potential actions or capacity assessments, but actually already implemented actions? And we found 1,682 articles. This was published in Nature Climate Change last year. I'm not going into the details right now, but just saying this is one of the sources we also drew upon in the adaptation gap report. And again, this didn't use any indicator at all. Instead, it was a structured coding and assessment of each of these articles, and then to see what are they saying. Another approach that is highly relevant under the global Stocktake is to look at, okay, what are countries themselves assessing about their own adaptation progress? And in fact, by now, more than 70 countries worldwide have a detailed national adaptation plan. Some countries call it differently. Canada is just developing a national adaptation strategy, which is due by the end of this year. But more than 70 countries already have a detailed policy instrument on adaptation. And so last year, I looked at, okay, which of these countries are actually have systems in place to track the implementation of these national adaptation plans. The result was that 60% of the countries that have adopted a national adaptation plan are not tracking their progress, or at least there's no evidence for that, which again puts into perspective the indicator number of countries with a plan, because apparently 60% aren't even following their own progress. But this list shows you the number of countries which are in different development stages and the countries which already report domestically on the adaptation progress. So the details are not relevant necessarily for today's presentation, but the key point is this is providing us unique, context-specific and politically kind of endorsed information from all these countries. And if more and more countries, or as more and more countries are reporting on their national progress on adaptation, we will get much more information that we can synthesize, for example, in the global Stocktake. So that's another very important approach, so to say, and it's a bottom-up approach from the countries. It does not use a top-down set of indicators.
About 2 more minutes, Timo.
Yeah. Okay, and then also I'm just coming to the closing slides. Thank you, Rachel. So I just wanted to point to the in the recent IPCC report, there is a so-called cross-chapter box on how to assess adaptation progress. And the expectations on the IPCC report have been high, but obviously would have been impossible for the IPCC to conduct an assessment of country progress and adaptation because the IPCC can only work with information that has already been published, and there is little on this aspect. But what we did compile in this progress box is to discuss the different pros and cons, as I've just been doing. So in this box, there's a table of different approaches and data sources and what their added values or limitations are for understanding adaptation globally. And the conclusion is, and let's see also with high confidence, there is no single best approach to assessing global progress and adaptation, but what we really need is a combination of multiple approaches and to understand, it's like a puzzle. So we're trying to put together the puzzle from different pieces of information to get an understanding of adaptation. And that's also the overall conclusion I have. I mean, I could continue talking about this for hours and hours and end, but I understand the presentation is coming to an end. So on this very kind of quick overview that I tried to give, the key takeaways are there is no single approach or data source to assess adaptation because the characteristics of adaptation are so different to mitigation. If we wanted to get a set of global adaptation indicators, the key question is, okay, what do you hope these indicators to do? And could we get indicators that are fit for purpose, noting the challenges of global data availability, standardized calculation methods, and political agreement? And so there are other pragmatic approaches, as I illustrated, for example, using information that countries present in their national adaptation progress reports, and of course, information from civil society and organizations, professional bodies like yours, because national reports don't always cover subnational level. And the conclusion is that to get a comprehensive picture of adaptation, we do need to combine different data sources. I didn't speak about the global goal yet or the GST, but I'm very happy to touch upon both of these in the discussion after Brittany's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Timo. That was an amazing overview of all of the potential ways that we could measure adaptation progress. And I think it's going to give us a great foundation and a shared foundation for getting into some of these more tactical questions about how do we engage in the negotiation space, knowing what these different options are. So thank you so much. We're going to turn it over now to Brittany Kroll. Brittany is currently an advisor to the NOAA Chief Scientist and also serves as a U.S. negotiator for science-related items under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Global Stocktake. Throughout her career, she has worked on a wide range of environmental policy issues, including the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, addressing coastal wetland loss, capacity building, and increasing engagement with new partners, including the private sector. Brittany has served on multiple U.S. delegations for the UNFCCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and World Meteorological Organization. She has a bachelor's degree in environmental studies from Franklin and Marshall College, a master's degree in global environmental policy from American University, and a master's degree from Johns Hopkins University in energy policy and climate and national security studies. Welcome, Brittany.
Thank you so much. I will share my screen. Awesome. Thank you. So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and thanks for ASAP for hosting this webinar. I'll preface my remarks by saying, as you probably heard from my bio, that I'm not an adaptation practitioner. And so I'm very much hoping that this presentation, coupled with Timo's presentation, will really enable a two-way conversation so that I can learn from you and to be able to better understand the issues that you're seeing to inform our engagement in the GST process. My presentation will cover a lot about the GST process and its intended outcomes, as well as how it relates to other adaptation processes under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. And I'll conclude with a set of discussion questions that I have for you that can hopefully prompt a really engaging conversation during the Q&A. So with that, let's dive in. You can stay on this slide. So the GST is a mandated process under the Paris Agreement. It is sometimes referred to as the ratchet mechanism of the 5-year ambition cycle, and it's meant to inform the nationally determined contributions that countries submit. And this GST will inform the next round of NDCs, which is in the 2024 to 2025 timeframe. As part of the GST process, there is a consideration of both implementation and ambition. In that way, it looks at what has been accomplished to date, as well as what needs to be done. So looking ahead at how we can best achieve the Paris Agreement. The GST in many ways is a comprehensive review of mitigation, adaptation, means of implementation, and support. It also considers efforts related to social and economic consequences and impacts of response measures, as well as averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change. Article 14, which is the specific article under the Paris Agreement where the GST is mandated, calls for the GST to be implemented in a comprehensive and facilitative manner, which includes the engagement of both party and non-party stakeholders. One important thing to note, though, is that the GST is looking at collective progress. It's not focused on individual countries or regions as part of the specific assessment. Next slide, please. So with that, what does the GST process look like? Based on this diagram, it probably looks very complicated, but in reality, there are 3 components to the process. And if you look carefully, you can see the tiny numbers in the picture that delineate what those processes or what those components are. So the first is the information collection and preparation phase. And that's the phase that we are in now. And that started at COP26 in November of 2021 and runs through June of 2023 next year. And there is a non-exhaustive list of inputs that are intended to be included as part of this information collection phase. And an information portal, which Rachel mentioned in her introduction, has been established to collect these inputs. So parties and non-party stakeholders, as well as intergovernmental organizations, are all providing information to contribute to the technical assessment, which is the second component of the GST. The technical assessment started during the June subsidiary body meetings of this year, and there will be another session held at COP27 in November, and then the third and final session will take place in June of 2023. The technical assessment is being co-facilitated by Farhan Akhtar of the US and Harold Winkler of South Africa. And they organize each of these 3 technical assessment sessions. The technical assessment is really where the consideration of the inputs and the information happens. And then as a result, there's a summary report that's generated after each of these individual sessions, with the report from the June session due out at any time. And another important thing to note about the technical assessment phase is that the co-facilitators, as well as the subsidiary body co-chairs, have emphasized that the GST is really a learning by doing process, and especially since this is the first one, there's an encouragement to do some experimentation for how we can make this robust, especially given the breadth of topics that need to be discussed. The third and final phase of the GST is the consideration of outputs. And this will include high-level events where the outcomes of the findings of the technical assessment are discussed and presented, as well as a consideration of what the implications of those findings are. It will also include identifying opportunities and challenges for enhancing action and support for collective progress, and summarizing recommendations for how we can best, how parties can best enhance action. And it's really this consideration of outputs is kind of the political discussion around what was found through the information collection and technical assessment. Next slide, please. So the comprehensive nature of the GST necessitates a process for organizing these discussions. As already mentioned, there are 3 themes: mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation. Plus, you have cross-cutting issues of equity and best available science. The subsidiary body chairs and co-facilitators developed a set of guiding questions for the information collection phase to help parties and non-party stakeholders to develop inputs that would be relevant. And there's also a set of guiding questions for the technical assessment. The themes are broad, and there's a concerted effort to really try and have the technical assessment to be an interactive dialogue, creating a space to talk about concrete ideas within the process and trying to break down the stovepipes across topic areas. But this is not really a natural way of operating within the process. And so again, just emphasizing this learning by doing is critical. On the slide here, you can see a couple of examples of the types of guiding questions that have been put forward. And then from these guiding questions, the co-facilitators design a session that can enable a deeper discussion about specific topics and sectors to really get into that exchange that will allow for concrete answers and sort of a solutions focus that can be most helpful for informing greater ambition. Next slide, please. So what did this look like during the first session in June? The images that you see here are illustrations of the highlights of the discussion. So just procedurally for the session, there was an opening and closing plenary with broad statements that were read by parties and non-party stakeholders. And then there were a set of roundtable discussions that were, again, intended to really facilitate this deeper dive into the guiding questions and into the specific topics that relate to each theme. And then lastly, there was a World Cafe, which provided another type of informal setting, again, to really try and enable conversation, a sharing of best practices, and spotlighting on specific topical issues that parties and non-parties had identified as key issues within their respective submissions. So a couple of highlights from these discussions, and again, the summary report with the full details will be available soon, included the conversation really focused on the need for locally led adaptation and recognizing the importance of context for adaptation action. Adaptation as an enabler of greater climate action writ large, especially in communities facing the impacts of climate change. The important roles of monitoring and evaluation frameworks, indicators, and reporting in understanding what is working and why. Tracking progression on national adaptation plans and how those are important instruments for adaptation planning, as well as questions about how to think about equity within adaptation and adaptation under different climate scenarios. So Timo highlighted the challenges of assessing adaptation outcomes, and you will probably notice a strong overlap between the challenges that he highlighted and the key topics for discussion within the GST. And he also importantly flagged that this is not the first time that assessment like this has tried to be done for adaptation. And in fact, the UNEP gap report is an input into the GST process. So lastly, I'll just say it's worth noting that the discussions from each of these technical assessment sessions are intended to build upon each other so that each session moves our understanding of the key issues a little bit further and going deeper into the specifics. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as mentioned earlier, the outcome of the GST is mandated in the Paris Agreement, and it is to inform parties in updating and enhancing their NDCs and enhancing international cooperation within this 5-year ambition cycle. Since we are still in the process, we can not predetermine any of the specific outcomes at this point. However, it is recognized that the scope and urgency of climate action needs to increase now. And so you're seeing a push for greater action and implementation without waiting for specific outcomes from the GST. This does not make the process irrelevant, but rather helps to put a spotlight on some of the specific needs. So from a US perspective, there are a couple of things that we're hoping the GST outcomes will be able to acknowledge. And so just to talk through a couple of those, since that adoption of the Paris Agreement, parties and other stakeholders have made progress towards enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability. And this has come through, among other things, the development and implementation of national adaptation plans and other strategies by many parties, national and local-led actions to increase resilience, multi-stakeholder initiatives that bring parties and others together to address adaptation priorities and support. And so identifying ways to better utilize and share these strategies can be an important outcome of the GST. However, as reflected in the IPCC Working Group 2 report, again, which Timo highlighted, significantly more effort and support is needed. And so you have efforts like the Global Goal on Adaptation trying to set out clear objectives while recognizing that adaptation priorities and needs will be largely dependent on different local situations. So how can we think about best translating our work to understand collective progress into locally led adaptation action and vice versa is going to be a key outcome. Next slide, please. So hearing about the GST process might raise questions for you about how this process relates to other adaptation processes under the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement. And I've highlighted a few here on this slide. So first to note is that they are all separate processes, but they are necessarily related. So for example, the first 4 processes, the outcomes from the Adaptation Committee, the Warsaw International Mechanism, the Nairobi Work Program, and Adaptation Communications and NAPS are all directly contribute to the GST through submissions, as well as through the engagement of members. The Global Goal on Adaptation work program is happening concurrent with the GST, but these 2 processes benefit each other, and going forward, the outcomes of the GGA will shape and inform the next GST. So both processes will wrap their respective outcomes in 2023. The same is also true of non-UNFCCC processes like the Sustainable Development Goals and the Sendai framework, which again contribute to the GST process and can be informed by GST outcomes. I think one of the key challenges is understanding how to best transfer and translate these lessons learned and outcomes between various processes and ensure these types of cross-processes exchanges are really taking place. Next slide, please. So after all the information about process and the status of the discussion, hopefully the importance of the GST is starting to crystallize. But I think there's a few things about the process that are worth highlighting, and ways that make it unique. First of all is the meaningful engagement and participation of non-party stakeholders. The technical assessment so far has been much more robust with contributions of these non-party stakeholders, and they bring in new ideas and perspectives about how to make progress and track accountability. And so having a space for these types of interactions is necessary for the scale and range of climate action that is needed. Second, even within the ambition cycle, the GST is an ambitious process. And so trying to look across all three themes and these cross-cutting issues within a single effort is enormous. And so having patience with this process while also setting high expectations is necessary. Third, we know that action can be enhanced through knowledge sharing. So coming away with a set of good practices and approaches for enhancing information exchange will benefit global action. And fourth, we do not have all the answers, but we know enough to act. And so having an emphasis on action while also identifying these information gaps can serve as a call to the science community to help us to fill these gaps. And similarly, it's the outcomes of the GST can help to send a clear signal to the broader international community about climate actions, priorities, and needs. And then lastly, through implementing a learning by doing process, there's novel approaches to engaging with each other, which can hopefully help to build trust and inspire action going forward. Next slide, and my final slide. I'll conclude by just offering a couple of discussion questions. One of the challenges with the GST is creating a space for more interactive discussion, which is why events like this and other events organized outside of the GST process are important for helping to advance the conversation and, more importantly, to advance on the ground action. I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brittany. It was just so valuable to get, sometimes these processes are really dense and you laid everything out so clearly, really building on that foundation that Timo set for us, but just really clearly laying out both the challenges and the opportunities. Thank you so much. So we're going to go to our Q&A now, and I want to invite folks to use the Slido to submit your questions. We don't have any questions yet, but I know that's just because people were so enthralled by the presentations that they haven't had a chance to type in questions yet. So while folks are submitting their questions, let's start out with this one for you, both Timo and Brittany. Timo, if you want to share first, in thinking about both the global goal on adaptation and the global stocktake, what do you feel like is the biggest opportunity that either one of these processes affords us as a global community to understand adaptation progress? What is, when you think about what gives you inspiration and hope in the opportunity space, what comes to mind first for you?
Thank you, Rachel. In fact, there are questions in the Slido. Maybe you're still in the presenters.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes,
so
I was on the
I'll
wrong tab. I was definitely on the wrong tab. Okay. Well, let's start with this question briefly, and then we will move to the Slido. Thanks.
Can I suggest the opposite too? Because
yes.
The question you just posed is quite broader. So maybe I focus on the specific ones first in Slido.
Okay, great. Yes, okay. Please go for it.
Okay, cool. One of the questions was if there are any requirements for countries or kind of templates or standards on what to report on adaptation. And the answer is reporting on adaptation is entirely voluntary under the Paris Agreement. Only mitigation reporting is mandatory. So countries can, if you want, they can report anything or everything or nothing on adaptation. There are different vehicles which they can use, which are called, for example, adaptation communications, or they can report under the biannual transparency reports on adaptation. For both of these, there are lists of topics which they can include. For the adaptation communications, the lists are actually quite similar. So there is no standardized template or anything, but countries are encouraged to report about different aspects, their vulnerabilities, their policies, what they're doing, their adaptation actions, ideally about the results of these actions, but there's no requirement or standardized format. Another question here is whether the PowerPoints will be available. Yes, I hope so. I mean, I will.
Yes, they will.
I think yes. Yeah, okay. The quality of reporting versus the quantity. So in the report, in the adaptation gap report, the colleagues have come up with a list of criteria to assess the quality. Here again, you can use different criteria to assess the quality, and there's certainly the adaptation gap report certainly isn't perfect in what it's doing, but the emphasis on looking at the quality of adaptation planning and not just number of plans, that's very important. And so you can find those criteria which they used in chapter 2 of the report, but the methodology could be refined. Then here, what are the expectations for countries coming on the COP? Maybe Brittany is in a better position to answer that one. Just browsing through the questions. So I've also posted a link to all my publications. I've been working on this topic for 10 years, so the list is not short. And I hope that you can find further information there on specific points. And oh yeah, final question I think here is on adequacy or sufficiency, whether there are any approaches. And so interestingly, in all these national adaptation M&E systems, I'm not aware that any of them looked at adequacy or sufficiency, because mainly these NAP M&E systems are built on the existing NAP. So the country would have judged that that is the standard that they want to reach, or these are the actions they have. So but there has been a technical paper from the adaptation committee under UNFCCC, which is looking at approaches to assess the global goal, and it also talks about adequacy. But there isn't a global approach or anything I would be aware of that would address that specifically. And the final two questions that just came in from Louis. Climate action pathways under the Marrakesh partnership. Yeah, that's a bit of a gap in our approach to the adaptation gap report, that we are mainly using national level data or data from global funds. So we currently have kind of a blind spot on all these other sub-national actions which are taking place, including those reported under the Marrakesh partnership. And the reason simply is that for the adaptation gap report, we need a global data set. We need to have this information for at least for every single developing country. And it's unfortunately not feasible at the moment for us to kind of reach out to every country and get such a list. But in principle, your question, so what you're pointing out is what the report or should be taking into account. And I think I have answered most of the questions addressed to me. Thank you.
Timo, I think that was the most efficient response to Q&A that I've ever seen. That was amazing. Brittany, I think the first question on this list for you is around expectations for countries at COP27. Are they expected to report out on progress?
Yeah, so just before diving into that question, I did want to just make a note on the point that Timo made about the voluntary reporting for adaptation in the process. I think one of the kind of things that's come up over the course of the discussion is within the GST, and I believe within other adaptation processes is, should there be mandatory reporting? And if so, what could that look like? And I think, the GST is, because of the nature of it, it is a way or it is a place to be able to have that discussion and to really think about, what that should look like. The negotiations and the development of the enhanced transparency framework were, really, really intense. So it's not it's no small thing to, to talk about mandatory reporting and what that should look like. But again, I think it's worth having a conversation about what that could be on the adaptation side, because one of the one of the things is that in order to have some sort of consistency and to be able to sort of look across and glean some lessons learned, if there's not, you know, a common metric, is at least having reporting coming from everywhere so that it's not biasing the you know, the data and the outputs. So then, as far as the expectations for COP, for COPs, so within the GST, there is the opportunity to provide submissions, like I said, throughout, and so countries can report on progress, they can share lessons learned, et cetera, and as well as non-party stakeholders. So that's an optional way of reporting as part of the information collection phase. And then within the discussions themselves, hopefully we will be getting an information note on what the second session of the technical assessment will look like, probably in October, so that parties can begin to prepare and determine, you know, what types of information they want to make sure to be able to share as part of the GST discussion. So it's not a formal or specific requirement on updating on progress, but there's opportunity as part of the discussion to talk about progress that individual countries are making, or that that groups are making, to be able to sort of share those good practices and lessons learned to help stimulate a discussion. And then I also saw there was a question about the urban adaptation gap, which was flagged on the image from the discussion, from the roundtable discussion. So I'm guessing that this is going to also be another kind of deeper conversation during the second session of the technical assessment coming up at COP, because there was a lot of conversation about sector, I guess you would call it kind of sector-based adaptation considerations, and this gap with urban adaptation was definitely one of the things that was highlighted. Maybe Timo would have specific resources that he could point you to. Alternatively, I can go back and chat with our folks and see if there's any good resources to indicate as well. I think those were
great. Thanks so much. Following in the tradition that we now have of very speedy response to questions. So there's one more question that just came in that's not showing up yet. And it's around, why would there be any expectations of a common metric, given that different countries and parts of countries face different climate change risks and have different levels of preparation, finances, et cetera, to deal with those risks? So kind of speaking to that equity piece and differences between countries.
That's a very good question. Thank you. So I've been wondering this too, but it seems that there's quite some excitement that built around the global stocktake and adaptation in it. I mean, of course, we are interested in understanding what progress are we making? Are we getting better adapted globally, nationally? And so I think that's the core, like there's this information need that we have. And people have different expectations on what the GST could be doing or what assessment of the global goal could be doing. And some people expect or assume that the GST would be coming up with a global framework of measurements that may or may not include a single metric. As I've presented, it's unrealistic to expect a single metric. But that's where this expectation is coming from. And what I was hoping to also do through my presentation is lowering the expectations on what can realistically be done. And it's interesting, as Brittany showed, the process of the GST is quite complex itself. And there are all these challenges in assessing adaptation progress globally, which even in the scientific community, we haven't figured out. But if you bring this to UNFCCC, you don't make the problem easier to solve, you make it harder to solve, because all of this is coming on top. So, but still people have expectations that the GST would get the magical summary of global progress, assessment of global progress, which unfortunately we won't get. a final, I did post a link in the on Slido on the report from the Adaptation Committee, which also has looked at the different approaches and the pros and cons. And recently, a couple of months ago, the Secretariat published a synthesis report on adaptation efforts based on countries' submissions. And I believe that the final GST might look relatively similar to that. So that was from April this year. And I think that's what we're going to get for the first GST. And as Brittany also said, the GST is next year, but the results have to be discussed next year in the intersessional negotiations in June. So the time span left is quite short. For the second GST in 5.5 years' time, maybe different, but for this year, we won't get much more than what I presented, in fact.
Yeah, and just to build on that response, I think, part of the desire to have, a single metric is for ease. People want one thing that they can point to and say, this, here's the answer. This is what we, this is the gap, or this is what we need. Something that's like easily quantifiable, and that adaptation sort of defies that, I think makes it really, really difficult for parties to kind of wrap their heads around and say, like, okay, well, how do we know what is successful? How do we know that collectively that we're making any progress? And so I hope that the GST can help to to dispel a little bit of the desire to have this single metric, that it wouldn't be advantageous for understanding our adaptation progress, and might sort of undermine the inherently local context that is so critically important here, and the equity considerations that feed into that. So. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think that is actually the perfect segue into the next section of our program, which is going to be an opportunity for folks to actually discuss these very questions in small groups. So, welcome back, everyone. I know that was only a short time to be in a small group discussion, but I hope that your group, like mine, just got some awesome nuggets in there. I want to give a chance for each facilitator to share one piece that they're taking away from their discussion. Timo, do you want to go first?
Yes, I was still trying to answer the questions in the chat. So very briefly, I think I've made the main points in my presentation, and when it will be shared, you can also click on all the links in it. Just want to mention one additional point that came up from the discussion we had with at the end with Brittany. So globally, there's always this push to have adaptation be similar or on parity with mitigation. And I think this is one of the reasons for this pressure to have like a quantified global framework or global indicator. But as Brittany already said, this isn't necessarily helpful, because adaptation simply is very different. And this is also what we reflected on in the discussion we just had in the breakout group. One participant asked, why are we even doing this? So is it even useful to try to measure adaptation? And so I think what we do need some sense of where we're going, is the sense of the direction of travel fine at the global level. What are the major gaps? We definitely need that. And we urgently need to go beyond, or get beyond the output level only, because it gives us the illusion that, we're making great progress because every country has an adaptation plan, but it doesn't say at all whether the country is getting better adapted. So that's what we need to breach. But we also discussed in the group that it's not realistic for UNFCCC to have a global, like a top-down blueprint on how adaptation would be done, and by extension, not a global blueprint on how every single adaptation action could be assessed. Again, inviting you to have a look at the IPCC report and the other sources. And thank you very much for having me again. Thank you.
Thank you, Timo. Brittany, do you want to share a little nugget from your discussion?
Yeah, we actually had a small group, but it was quite a helpful and indulgent discussion for me. I received a lot of resources and links to really helpful tools. But in general, we talked about sort of this relationship between, having a single metric, or maybe not relationship, but sort of the conflation of having a single metric versus just a systematic approach for looking at adaptation. And I think this, harkens exactly to what Timo was just talking about. We also spent a little bit of time talking about sort of the challenge of translating lessons learned and information across processes, and at different levels, from global down to the local level, and how you can sort of better connect those dots, and enable sort of information sharing, but kind of more importantly, like information sharing that then leads into action.
Awesome.
So
yeah,
great takeaways.
Thank you so much. And Abhinand, how about your group?
Yeah, we also had a very power-packed sort of 12-minute express discussion, which raised a lot of points on what it means to define adaptation. And, I think echoing what Timo and Brittany were saying, that there's no unified sort of definition of adaptation. It's very locally specific, and there's a need for sort of like communities to define it. And there was also a lot of discussion around pushing the boundaries of what it means to engage communities. Contrary to our conventional approach of just like, convening stakeholders, there's also an need to evaluate how much of input is actually going from stakeholders into the policies that are being implemented, and what are the sort of outcomes that are being generated as a result, and where are the sort of benefits and burdens being distributed. I think that level of that also is part of engagement, and that's a step that's often missed, I would say, in adaptation planning, or the group is discussing about. So yeah, that's mostly it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to each and every one of you. We're at time here, so I have put in the chat the most important links. You'll get everything from this event, but please submit your content in our shared Google Doc for ASAP's input into the GST information portal. The link is there. And if you'd like to join the work group of folks who are going to be synthesizing that comment into our actual submission, you can email Brianna, and her email is there as well. There's also a link to provide feedback on this event. I want to give a huge thank you to Timo and Brittany as our expert presenters. Abhinand will be joined by John Phillips and David Dodd. Those are our founding members of our synthesis work group. So thank you so much to the three of you. Thank you to Megan and Brianna, our ASAP webinar staff today. And then I hope that you'll join us for upcoming opportunities at ASAP. We have over 10 peer learning groups that meet monthly. And right now we're running our peer learning topic submission process. So you can submit a peer learning topic by September 26th for 2023. And up next in our co-creation webinar series, we're going to be joining ASAP's policy practice group to discuss the adaptation workforce on December 2nd. If you're not an ASAP member yet, I hope that you'll join us as a member, that you'll consider donating to ASAP. And if you need to access people, ideas, and resources for your adaptation work, please reach out to me directly or to any of our staff. We're always here to help you. Again, thank you so much to our speakers and facilitators and staff. I hope everyone has a wonderful day.